everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Karina Boycheva, and I'm an instructional designer on the DQ University team. Joining me today is Paul Bowman, who is our Director of Training at DQ. And today we're going to be focusing on customer service for people with disabilities. Here is our agenda for today. We're going to be discussing some etiquette principles and language guidelines, how to have a successful first interaction with customers, as well as identify some strategies for providing equal access and ensuring effective communication. And we will have some time at the end for questions if you do have them. So, good customer service starts with understanding etiquette principles. Now, many people, of course, learn basic manners in childhood. And a lot of etiquette really has to do with common sense and general principles that you would apply when interacting with all customers. So here, we'll just highlight 5 principles that can really set the stage for your interactions. And they are respect, displaying a welcoming attitude, courtesy, patience, and a desire to help. So let's make these principles come to life a little bit with some examples in the context of serving customers with disabilities. Let's say that you have a customer who is deaf walk into your office, and he has a sign language interpreter with him. Now, often people will speak directly to the interpreter while ignoring the deaf person because it might seem intuitive to them. Meaning that they might think, well, why would I direct my words to the deaf person directly if they can't hear me? Doesn't it make more sense to speak to the interpreter? And the answer is no. Even though a deaf person can't hear what you're saying, they may have lip reading ability, and you also communicate volumes with your body language. So in this case, the respectful thing to do is to speak directly to them. If you speak to the interpreter and ignore the deaf person, it's actually quite disrespectful. Now, imagine talking about someone who's right in front of you as if they aren't even there. Another common mistake is to automatically start speaking very slowly and loudly to all people with disabilities, as if talking to a child. This might be a bit subtle, or it might be very pronounced, but this is considered quite rude, and unfortunately, it's something that people with disabilities encounter often. So the respectful thing to do is to talk to adults like adults. But now, let's say that someone who is hard of hearing asks you to speak up or speak more slowly, then of course it's appropriate to do that. Now let's illustrate the principle of displaying a welcoming attitude. Of course, one of the essential components of good customer service is making people feel welcome. For example, let's say that you encounter a person who is in a wheelchair. Oftentimes, people will not even make eye contact with a person using a wheelchair because they think, well, is it rude? Is this considered staring? Maybe I better just look away. Now, this is definitely much more likely to happen outside of a customer service relationship, for example, on the street, but it can happen in business as well. And in this situation, the right thing to do is to make eye contact, smile, and just greet the person as you would any customer. Courtesy is another big principle. For example, let's say that you're a museum guide and are giving a tour, and you notice that a customer using a mobility device is having a hard time keeping up with the pace. The right thing to do is to slow the pace down. And again, you'll notice that this is really just about being observant and considerate of other people. The situation happens to be about serving customers with disabilities, but the general principles about how to treat people well are really the same. Patience is the next big one, and this is absolutely essential. Sometimes when you're providing customer service to people with disabilities, the interactions can take more time, and that's okay. For example, you might have someone who has a speech disability or a traumatic head injury, and it might take them longer to finish sentences. Sometimes there may be an impulse to finish a person's sentence for them. Maybe we think that we're being helpful, and we don't want to watch someone struggle to find the words when we can just quickly help them out. But it's actually not the right thing to do in this context. Just give people enough time to communicate and make them feel worthy of your time by being patient. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about having a desire to help. This is, of course, at the heart of all customer service interactions. But here's a key thing to keep in mind. Not all customers with disabilities will need or want help. For example, you might notice that someone who is using a mobility device is taking longer to open a door. Now, many of us would immediately jump and open the door, and that isn't a bad thing necessarily. But in this case, the appropriate thing to do is to ask. You can just smile and say, "Hey, can I get the door for you?" And the reason for that is that many people with disabilities prefer to do things independently, even if it takes them longer. So we must be aware of that and respect people's choices. This is just a good example of the value of not making assumptions. And now, let's take a look at some top tips for interacting with customers with different types of disabilities. There are, of course, many, but we'll just go ahead and focus on the top 3 in each category. So first, when you're interacting with people with physical disabilities, don't touch their device without permission. For example, people in wheelchairs feel frustrated when others sometimes unconsciously lean on their wheelchair, and it's very disrespectful to do that. Or maybe you notice that someone is struggling to get over a threshold, and the impulse might be to automatically push their wheelchair over it just to be helpful. But again, that isn't the right thing to do. Always ask for permission first. Another big one is eye contact. Of course, staring is not good, but avoiding eye contact altogether is bad as well, as I mentioned before. So just relax and focus on the conversation and what the person is saying, and make a normal amount of eye contact. And then finally, if there are chairs around, have a seat so you're at the same eye level and can speak more easily. Okay, now how about interacting with customers who are blind or have low vision? One of the best things you can do is to verbally identify yourself when first approaching. Another thing you should do is to speak normally. One big pitfall to avoid is, again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes people unconsciously automatically start speaking loudly and slowly to people with any type of disability. And they may not even realize they're doing it, but it's a patronizing thing to do. So if a person is blind and they are not hard of hearing, then they can hear just fine with a normal volume of speaking. Another important thing is to let service animals do their work without any distractions. A lady I know who has a service dog first taught me that even maintaining eye contact with a service animal can be distracting. And her expression was, just pretend that the service animal is a piece of furniture. So in an office environment, this may not be a life or death situation. But for example, if a service animal is helping their owner cross the street and someone distracts them, then obviously this can have some very dangerous consequences. So next, let's talk about customers who are deaf or hard of hearing. A really good thing that you can do is to face the person and don't cover your mouth while speaking. Some people have lip reading ability, and so this allows them to read your lips without struggling to see them. And then, as we mentioned before, make sure that you speak directly to the person who is deaf or hard of hearing rather than an interpreter if there's one present there. And a third tip that's really critical is to never brush off a person by saying, "never mind," or "it's not important." So maybe you try saying something 2 or 3 times and they don't understand you. Rather than just waving your hand and saying, "it's okay, never mind," even if you mean it kindly, it's often interpreted as insulting. So if repeating doesn't work, then try rephrasing what you're saying or even just writing it down. And then let's go over one more. Top 3 tips for interacting with people who have intellectual or learning disabilities. Again, I will say here that a good thing to do is to speak normally. I know I'm really driving this point home, but it's very important. Sometimes people will speak like they're talking to a child, especially towards someone with an intellectual disability, which is definitely very offensive to an adult. So just speak as you normally would. Of course, you can modify your speech and slow down if needed, but don't do this automatically when you first interact with a person. And here's another good one. So maybe someone says something unclearly and you have no idea what they just said. And maybe you feel like it will be rude to ask them to repeat. But it isn't rude. Don't pretend to understand someone. You can just ask them to repeat. Or say what you think they said and ask them if you heard correctly. And then finally, keep in mind that disabilities in this category can be very diverse. And so we definitely can't expect a one-size-fits-all approach to customer service. So rather than making assumptions, the best thing you can do is simply to ask them how you can assist them if they do need your help. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about language. Language is a critical element in how our thoughts and our opinions are shaped. So historically, as you may know, language related to disabilities has been quite negative and even very cruel. So words like invalid, deformed, lunatic, vegetable, they're not really in mainstream use today as they have been in past decades or past centuries. We have really come a long way from using these belittling words like cripple or retarded to using much more respectful language such as wheelchair user or person with an intellectual disability. Now, in terms of language related to disability, many or even most adults already know which words are blatantly offensive and should never be used, such as the ones I just mentioned. But here's something else to think about. There are more subtle ways to accidentally offend someone with a disability without meaning to. For example, a phrase that we still hear is vision impairment, or maybe this person suffers hearing loss, or maybe this person is wheelchair bound. All three of these examples convey a sense of negativity. And that's really not what we're trying to do in good customer service, and even in general when we're interacting with people. We want to make people feel respected and empowered. So here is a good principle to keep in mind, and it's called people first language. The idea is to place emphasis on someone as a person first, and then if it's relevant to a given situation, then mention the disability. Now, this can have two interpretations. The first is literally using the word person first, and then following that with words to describe the disability. So for instance, person who is blind rather than blind person. But that doesn't have to be true all the time. It isn't rude to say blind person or deaf person. It also has a lot to do with your overall intent. So the goal should be to emphasize someone as a person first in all aspects of the conversation, even if you don't literally use people first language 100% of the time. But keep in mind that people first language is just one perspective. There are definitely others. For example, some members of the disability community prefer identity first language. For instance, autistic person or deaf person or blind person, rather than person with autism, and so on. And the reason for that is that people might identify strongly with their disability being a big part of who they are, and so they prefer to use that identifier first when speaking about themselves or other members in the community. But here's the thing. Don't worry excessively or panic or think, oh no, I have to remember all these rules and guidelines. That's not the point at all. Use broad guiding principles such as respect and treating people with dignity. Use neutral words such as has hearing loss rather than negative ones such as suffers hearing loss. And also be willing to learn someone's personal language preferences, and you'll be just fine. And I want to mention one more thing on the topic of language. Be careful with euphemisms. And what I mean by that is don't use them. Most people with disabilities actually find them very offensive. So for example, something like differently abled or special needs or handy-capable or challenged, don't use these words because they are patronizing. So the key takeaway here is to use neutral words, not negative ones or euphemisms. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at some more specific examples. So here we're going to create 4 personas of customers that you might encounter. First, we have Lisa, and she's a customer who is blind. Then we have Rashad, a customer who is deaf. Next, we have Daniel, a customer who uses a wheelchair. And finally, we have Maria, and she is a customer who has an intellectual disability. And we're just going to walk through some scenarios of how to provide great customer service if each of these people walks into your office. So we'll talk about the first approach, some strategies for providing equal access, and how to ensure effective communication. All right, so let's start with our first customer. This is Lisa, and she is blind. So Lisa might walk up to your counter, and she has her guide dog with her and is using a white cane. And she may say, "Excuse me, where's the bathroom?" Well, this is someone who relies on very explicit directions, not vague or general words. And so you wouldn't want to say, "Oh, just down there at the end of the hall." You would want to say something like, "It's straight down the hallway to your left, the third door down." And remember that we should not make assumptions about what a person does or doesn't need. Now, Lisa may be perfectly fine with navigating independently, or she may prefer your assistance. So you could follow up with, "Would you like any assistance in getting there?" And in this case, let's say that she does accept your offer. You can go ahead and ask her how she would like to be guided. The standard way is that you fold your arm at the elbow and the person holds onto your elbow gently and walks slightly behind you, just like is shown on the image on screen. And don't be afraid to ask someone what is the best way to help if you don't know. It's okay not to have all the answers. The first time that I ever interacted with a blind person, she asked me to help her to the bathroom. And I said, "Sure, but I've never done this before, so how can I help?" And she taught me how to do it. And so that is how an initial interaction might go with someone who is blind. Now, what are some other things that you can do? You'll want to, of course, ensure service animal access. Remember that service animals are allowed in most places where the public can go, although there are some exceptions, even if there is a no pet policy. They are allowed in because they're not considered pets. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that ensures this. And there are also many state and local laws that also allow service animals to enter places of business and other public areas. You can also offer information about the physical environment to Lisa or about the layout of the room. And remember, if you're serving as a sighted guide, make sure that you don't leave someone in the middle of the room and walk away, because that's very disorienting. You want to guide them to a seat, for example. And then have a look around and make sure that there's a clear path of travel for Lisa. If there are any possible obstacles, you should alert her. And this is actually something that's good to plan in advance when you're setting up furniture arrangements, to make sure that customers can comfortably get around. And this includes people who are blind or have low vision, and also people who use mobility devices. So those are just some things that you can do to have a good interaction with Lisa. Now let's move on to our persona, Rashad. And he is a customer who is deaf. So Rashad walks up to the front desk where you're working and he asks you a question. And you answer it, but he doesn't understand your response even after you repeat it. So what should you do? Well, you can ask him or jot down, "What's the best way for us to communicate?" If you don't have a pen and paper handy, you can even just type it out on your smartphone and show him. Sometimes people who are deaf or hard of hearing will actually carry their own pad and paper for just these kinds of situations, but you should always be prepared as well. And then let's say that a little bit later, Rashad is sitting away from you filling out some paperwork and you need to get his attention. Well, what's the best way to do that? So the goal here is to avoid startling people, and also never to touch people without permission, unless it's an emergency, of course. So you could walk up to him so he can see you, or you could wave to him, or you can even tap on the table gently next to him. And then remember, as we discussed before, be sure that you speak normally and don't exaggerate your lip movements. It doesn't help with lip reading. It actually makes it harder. And then, of course, you'll want to face Rashad when you're speaking and keep your mouth uncovered. Here's a quick thing I want to mention. Many people assume that all people who are deaf or hard of hearing can lip read and speak sign language, but that is a myth. It isn't actually true. And you might find it surprising that only about 30% of the English language is understandable by lip reading because so many words look the same when they're spoken. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay, then let's talk a little bit about Daniel. And he is a customer who uses a wheelchair. And he comes into your office for an appointment. So one of the best things you can do is way before you ever have an interaction with Daniel. And that is to ensure that there's a clear path of travel that is wide enough for a wheelchair. So look around in your place of business and see if that's the case, and make rearrangements if necessary. And let's say that Daniel wants to check in for his appointment. Make sure that there's a way for him to do that comfortably. So either that means having a lowered counter that is wheelchair accessible, or you can have a clipboard handy, or some other way that works well. Another good thing is make sure that there are accessible seating areas. So if you look around the room, check to see, can a customer comfortably park their wheelchair in this room? And again, if it's necessary, make rearrangements to the layout. And then finally, place relevant items where they can be reached from a sitting position. We want to avoid making people have to reach excessively. And we basically want the setup of things to allow people as much independence as possible. And those are just some of the things that you can think about when you're delivering great customer service to people who use mobility devices. And then let's move on to our final persona. And this is Maria, and she is a customer who has an intellectual disability. Now, first of all, be aware that intellectual disabilities are often hidden. So you may never know that a person has this type of disability. You might get some information based on behavioral and communication cues, and then you can use this to help guide you in delivering a good customer service experience. So let's say that Maria comes up to you, and she wants to learn more information about registering for a workshop. And you let her know how she can do that, but you can tell that she's having some difficulty with following all the steps. So a good thing to do in this case is to break it up into smaller tasks. For example, you can say, to register, first I'll need to see your ID. May I please see that? And then so on with all the other steps. Another thing to be aware of is that sometimes, but definitely not all the time, cognitive disabilities are related to speech disabilities. So maybe you're having a difficult time understanding what Maria is saying to you. It's a bad idea to pretend to understand. It's not rude to ask someone to repeat what they are saying. You can even say to her, I think you said XYZ. Is that right? And also, if it applies to a specific scenario, you can provide a completed example. For instance, this is what a completed registration form looks like. Keep in mind that people who have intellectual disabilities might sometimes feel frustrated if they feel like they're hitting a roadblock within themselves or with you or with others. So just remember to be patient. It's okay to allow these interactions to take more time, and remember not to rush people. Good customer service means showing people that they are worthy of your time. So that's it for our 4 personas here to really illustrate how to apply some of these principles to real scenarios. And you've probably noticed by now that these principles are really the same for all customers. But when it comes to customer service for people with disabilities, there are some certain subtleties that can really make a difference in how you make a customer feel. Simply being aware of them and maybe making slight alterations in how you do things can really elevate the service that you offer and leave a great lasting impression on your customers. And trust me, people will notice and they will remember you for providing great service. If you want to learn more on the topic of customer service for people with disabilities, we have recently released a customer service curriculum in DQ University. It consists of 4 courses that are available together as a single package. So please feel free to check that out if this topic is relevant to you. You can find more information on dquniversity.com. So now we have covered quite a few concepts related to etiquette. But customer service, of course, goes way beyond that. Many aspects go into ensuring that customers have a good experience with you and with your service or product. And now I will hand the mic over to Paul Bowman, and he will talk a little bit about some more concepts that you should be aware of.
All right. So one of the topics that I was going to talk about was chat features on websites. But before I get to that, some of the things that Karina was saying brought to mind a couple of experiences that I had a little bit out of the context of customer service, but just in daily interactions. I was out of town visiting some historical sites, and a woman in an electric wheelchair was coming along on the sidewalk. We were coming perpendicular to the sidewalk, and we were about to merge. And if you've ever seen someone in an electric wheelchair who can go really fast, they can be a lot faster than someone walking. And there were a group of us, and so we were about to end up in the same spot. The people who were walking got there a little bit first, and most people in my group were just kind of doing their own thing, not really paying attention. But I noticed this woman in the wheelchair, and she had this look of frustration, just very subtle on her face, because she could tell that we were about to block her from being able to go as quickly as she wanted to. So I turned to her and smiled and just looked directly at her and said, why don't you go on ahead of us? I can tell you're going to be a lot faster than we are. And she got kind of a chuckle out of that, and sure enough, she turned on the speed and zoomed past us pretty quickly. So it's little things like that make a big difference in the lives of people with disabilities. It's just treating them as normal people and recognizing that they have desires and needs just like the rest of us. And in this case, she just wanted to make sure that she got from point A to point B without having us block her way. Another quick anecdote, this was just walking along the street, and there was a person who had a cane who was obviously blind, and so he stopped at the intersection, and I noticed him, and I just did a quick kind of a survey of the situation to see if he needed any help, and he didn't, and so I just kept walking. But then there was kind of some commotion nearby, and he asked out loud to nobody in particular, because I think he had heard me walk past him, and he assumed that maybe I was still close. But he asked, did it turn? Is it safe for me to cross? And then the signal turned, and the walk sign made the noises, and he's like, oh, okay. And so he kind of answered his own question. I would have had to yell to really answer his question, so I just kind of let him do his thing. But just in terms of what I was trying to do, I tried to survey the situation quickly, see if he needed help. I didn't think he did, so I just left him alone. He did actually briefly ask for help, but then as soon as the walk signal made the sound, then he was like, oh, okay. And he was just fine after that. So for the most part, I assume that people don't need help, but in a few cases they might, and I just try to pay attention and kind of give them the benefit of the doubt. On the topic of online chat features, they are a good way to provide customer service for, let's say, online retail or could be a phone company, or lots of different things that you could do that would have a chat as a relevant feature. And one of the things you have to know right away is that most of those chat features are not accessible to blind users. And the reason being there's certain things that have to happen for their software, the screen reader software, to be able to get the interaction right. And so if they can't interact with that, then a person who is blind is probably not going to be able to use that. That said, those forms of interaction, if they are accessible, can be a fantastic way for people with disabilities to ask questions and get answers to their questions. For someone who is deaf, that could be a fantastic way. Even if the interface is technically not accessible according to the guidelines, someone who is deaf may not need all the accessibility features. They just simply need to type and see your responses. And so for them, it can be great, even if your interface happens to technically be inaccessible by the guidelines. But for the blind user, you would want to make it accessible completely. If you are answering questions as the person on the other end of that chat, things to keep in mind would be that sometimes some users would need to have more time to type up the responses. So don't just assume that they've checked out. Ask them, do they need more time? Or are they still there? That sort of a thing. One kind of broad consideration is a lot of times companies like to offer the certain options for free and certain options at a charge. So for example, they may have the online chat for free and they may charge for a phone call as a way to answer questions. And as logical as that may sound for some things, it can be really detrimental for someone who can't use the chat. So let's say that you are that blind person using a screen reader, you try to use the chat, find out that it doesn't really work, you can't make use of it, and so you have to call the phone number. And if you call and they say, okay, there's going to be a charge of whatever it happens to be, it's not intentional discrimination against people with disabilities, but it ends up being discrimination in the end, and it ends up being costly for the person with the disability. So just something to keep in mind there. And see if I can review my notes here for any other quick points. Let's say that you're working at a software company and the chat feature is intended to, or even if you're on the phone call, intended to give them instructions on how to use an interface. That's good. So having that feature is fantastic. But if you start referring to things as the red button or the button in the lower right corner, then the person who is blind is going to be at a disadvantage, and they may say, well, I can't see, I don't know where the red button is, or they don't know where the placement is on the screen. So you have to be careful to use the actual labels when you're talking about things. So you'd say the submit button, or whatever the label happens to be for the form input. Make sure you're using those actual labels. So those are a few quick points, and I see that there are some questions coming through the chat and in the Q&A. So Karina, I'm going to defer to you really quickly as to how you want to handle that. Do you want to go to the questions, or did you want to?
Yeah, I think we can definitely go to questions. Thank you so much, Paul. That was some really great info because, I want to mention, as we all know, that a lot of customer service is remote these days. So there are many different things that you can think about, as Paul illustrated. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think we can definitely open it up for questions. So please feel free to type them into the chat box if you haven't yet, and then Laura will relay them to us.
Okay, so we do have a question here. I'll let you two choose who wants to answer it. This person is asking, if a person who is calling is someone who is deaf, how can I effectively communicate with them? And I assume this is specifically related to a phone call.
Yes. So a lot of deaf people will use relay services. And one of the best things you can do is to not hang up if you hear silence for a while. A lot of times people think it's a marketing call and they'll hang up, but oftentimes it's a deaf person trying to reach you. And then you would speak through a third party that would then relay the information to them. So that's just something to keep in mind. Don't hang up right away. And if they're reaching out to you, then they're already doing it via communication means that are accessible to them. So you would just speak normally and someone relays the information to them. Some people also use a text telephone. So that's another method they can use. But
Yeah,
again, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just one quick story. I got a few stories to tell about these topics. Way back in my college days, I actually was asking out a girl on a date who was deaf. And I met her in a sign language class. She was learning sign language for the first time as an adult, as a college student. And I was interested. And so I had to go through the somewhat embarrassing process of using the phone relay system to ask her out on a date. So the process was I had to talk basically directly to an operator, a relay person whose job it is to relay the information. So I'd speak just as I would normally. This other person on the other end would then convert that into text, which the person would receive on the other end. The good news at the end of all that is she did accept the date. We did go out on the date, but that's how it works. So it's simply a matter of I ended up talking to a different person directly, but then I got the information relayed to me back from the person that I was actually talking to. So that's how that works.
Good anecdote. And a quick note on that is to speak directly to the person. So not, hey, tell Lisa that this or that. You just speak, "Hey Lisa, how are you doing?" And then the third party relays that.
Great, thanks guys, and yeah, great anecdote, Paul. I have another question here. Glenn is asking, how many times can you ask someone to repeat what they're saying? Is like perhaps after 2 or 3 attempts, it might feel a bit awkward. In that point, would you ask to look for a different way to communicate, or would you write it down?
Yeah, you can definitely remain flexible. I think, 2 or 3, maybe even 4 or 5. It just depends on the situation. And then you can look for a different way. Maybe someone can try to point to what they mean to say or use a nonverbal way to communicate. So I understand what you're saying. I can definitely understand after a few times it might feel a little strange.
Okay, another question here. Carol is asking, she says, I work in a medical office. If a deaf person prefers to text their cell phone, how would we do that since they don't use cell phones to communicate with their patients?
Is it that it's a legal thing that you would not be able to communicate via the cell, like texting?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question either.
Yeah, we'll let Carol respond and then get back to that. That's a good follow-up question. Carol just says that they don't have cell phones to communicate with their patients.
So you could have just, the good old fashioned way of just a pen and a paper to jot something down. And like I said, that oftentimes people who are deaf or hard of hearing bring their own, but it's helpful if you have, a set in the office so that you're prepared yourself.
Great. Another question here asking, how do you handle a case when a person with a disability is asking to be served immediately instead of perhaps waiting in line like everybody else?
That's a good one. I think that we definitely have to exercise some patience, and maybe that might require maybe repeating it several times and being kind and patient. And I think people who work in customer service, in any customer service, can encounter customers that want attention right now. And the best thing that you can do is not escalate the situation and then just remain patient. And if it were me, I would just repeat as many times as necessary. And you can also seek help. If you don't know how to solve a problem yourself, you have a manager that can help you. You don't have to have all the answers yourself.
Yeah, just one follow-up to that one. There's sometimes a backstory to that sort of a situation. So it could be that the person has already gone through other people to get an answer, and they've been frustrated and maybe had roadblocks to getting the service that they need. And that could be true whether they have a disability or not. So I would probably just say, ask the person what the situation is. And it's not wrong, for example, to, after you ascertain the situation, to say, I thank you for letting me know. We've got a couple more people in front of you, but as soon as we get to your turn in line, then we'll be more than happy to help out. It's not wrong to let people wait in line if they have a disability, of course. I mean, they don't have special privileges just because they have a disability, but at the same time, be mindful that they may have already gotten the runaround from other people, and so there may be circumstances you're not aware of, and that's just something to keep in mind.
Great point.
Great point. Thank you. I have another question here. Is how can I politely end a conversation due to lack of time and other appointments without coming off as rude?
I think that can be a question that we all struggle with, even not in customer service. Sometimes there's a pause in the conversation and you can sneak that in there. You can say, thank you so much, but I really have another meeting to get to, or I have another obligation or responsibility. Sometimes there is not such a pause. Sometimes people will continue to speak. So in that case, if you really need to go and you have a meeting, then you can just excuse them, say, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to let you know that, and then end the conversation.
Yeah, and another thought there, since this is such a broad question that could apply to anybody who's caught in a conversation at a party or anything like that they want to get out of, but if if you examine yourself in that moment, and if the reason you're trying to get out of it is because you feel uncomfortable because the person has a disability, that would be a completely different scenario that you should, maybe ask yourself why you feel so uncomfortable. But in general, whatever method you use to politely excuse yourself from a conversation is the exact same method you would use for a person with a disability. It's actually not different, unless your motives are because the person has a disability, which would be not quite as good.
And I will piggyback and say on that the best way to become comfortable interacting with people with disabilities is to practice. So if there's a situation and you're uncomfortable, challenge yourself to stay in that situation and make improvements with what you're doing and what you're feeling. So that would be a good opportunity to take, to have
and one more quick thought on that one. It's pretty common for people to say, well, here's this blind person, I don't know what we have in common. And if you stop and think about that for a second, you have whatever you have in common is in common. The fact that that person is blind is something you may not have in common, but in a sense, it's irrelevant to all the other things that you might, so people are people. Maybe that person is completely different from you in nearly every way, but most likely you've got something in common. It's the fact that they have a disability is not their full identity. It's a part of it, and it's there's a person behind that.
And 1 in 5 people in the US have a disability. So many of us are walking around with hidden or obvious disabilities. So the chances are that you've already interacted with plenty of people, or you may be a person with a disability yourself.
Great. Another question here. Kind of switching things a little bit, talking more about what if the person with a disability is the one who is taking the customer service calls? I'm not sure if you both are familiar with that. Maybe we'll have to answer this offline. But Perva is asking, is it recommended to have a unique customer service number that routes to staff who have screen reader expertise or who are screen reader users themselves?
So let me actually take this one first, just because I have an experience there. So as part of my job, since I am required to test websites for accessibility, I'm required to know how to use a screen reader. At one point, I actually called in to the makers of the JAWS software, which is a screen reader software. And this is not to my credit, but I assumed that the other person on the other end was sighted. And I didn't really think about it at all. And I said a few things as I was talking, that basically saying things I shouldn't, in the sense of, talking about the interface in visual terms. And then the person on the other end was taking a little bit longer to respond, and it took a moment to click. And then I heard the faint sound of the screen reader as this person was talking. It's like, oh, darn. I just committed the cardinal sin of assuming that this person didn't have a disability. And then, but this person was using JAWS to answer my questions about JAWS, which is perfect. It was actually, excuse me, exactly what I needed. But I wrongly assumed that the person didn't have a disability, so just be careful about that. But in terms of how to handle it if you're the one providing the customer service, provide a special number, I don't think so. Unless there's some real need for a specific audience to specifically contact someone with a disability, which seems such a small need, I don't think that I would differentiate. So if they're qualified to provide customer service, whether they have a disability or not, just include them with everybody else.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Looks like we might be coming to the end of our questions, but we'll give it one more moment. So if anyone has any final questions. Here's one specific, to our DQ University team. When will the DQU product have the web testing course refreshed?
The web testing course?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, we have a few web testing courses, so I'm not 100% sure which one is being referred to there, but I can say that I did just create a couple of videos of using our software tools, which have not yet been integrated into that course. So basically, we are constantly updating our courses, and we kind of take turns as to which courses we update. So if you're feeling that course needs a refresh, I'd actually would appreciate an email. If you want to send an email to training@dq.com to give us specific feedback on things that you would want in a specific course, we're actually very happy to receive that. And we will be integrating some other videos about how to use some of the browser add-ons that we have. So that'll be an update. But for the specifics, it would take probably a while to talk about because I'm not sure exactly which part of which course you're talking about.
Great, thanks, Paul. Okay, so it looks like we're at the end of our questions for today, but I want to thank Karina and Paul. I want to thank you both for doing such an excellent job with the presentation and getting to these questions. If anyone has a question that we didn't get to, be sure to email me and I'll get those fielded to Karina and Paul. And just a friendly reminder, this is again being recorded. We will send the recording and these slides out via email later this week. And be sure to also check out the DQ University course. This webinar was just a primer to some of the great content that Karina and Paul both work on that we're really proud of here at DQ. And I think you'll get even more out of the DQ University courses that we have on this subject. So with that, I want to wish everybody a great rest of their Tuesday, and thanks for joining us today.